So, for those who are unfamiliar with me, uh, here on YouTube, um, this is the first time that I've been on YouTube. So, we'll see what happens. This, call it what you will, call it an experiment, call it a pilot, call it what you want, but we'll see how this comes along. Um, this, of course, is going to be a show that deals with, I would argue, different aspects, not just literature, but also TV and film. We're going to be examining different aspects. And the first aspect we're going to be examining is what I call the Shakespeare myth. Now, which is what this show is titled. Now, why is this called the Shakespeare myth? Primarily because the idea that William Shakespeare was the author of the more than 30 plays and numerous sonnets attributed under his name is what I have seen, and from what I have read and what I gleaned, a mythology. It's an official mythology, which seems like a contradiction, right? How could something official be a mythology? But when you look at the life of Shakespeare, and when you look at um, the extent to which Shakespeare uh, is cited as the author of the plays, and then look at the plays themselves, you realize that there is a problem. You realize that there is very little that you know about William Shakespeare, the man. And you know more about the plays and more about the sonnets because you have in your possession, or at least copies of them under your possession. Most people are not going to read the so-called First Folio, which was reportedly the first collection of Shakespeare's plays that came together in one volume. And it was the first time, I believe, that all of these plays, which are attributed to William Shakespeare, were collected under the name William Shakespeare. So, the Shakespeare myth, right? Now, to be clear to those who may not be familiar with this, there are different names that come up on YouTube, right? You have what is known as the Shakespeare authorship question, which is basically those who disagree with the idea that William Shakespeare was the author of the plays, right? So these are the ones that, much like me, disagree with, not so much disagree, but contest uh, the well established belief that William Shakespeare was the author of the plays and the sonnets. So that's important to establish. It's known in many circles as the Shakespeare authorship question, right? Did Shakespeare write the plays and sonnets attributed to him? Then you have the term anti-Stratfordians. Now, that, of course, the fact that William Shakespeare, the man, was born in country town of Stratford upon Avon in England. And so those that disagree or contest, most importantly, that Shakespeare wrote the plays attributed to him, are known, I would say pejoratively, as anti-Stratfordians, right? Technically, I would fall that rubric, that umbrella, but I don't like the term anti-Stratfordian, though I note it here. So it's very important to note. I think the better way to look at it would not be anti-Stratfordian, but I would say I would call myself basically a revisionist, right? So I'd get away from the pro and anti. And those, of course, who are uh, believers in Shakespeare as the author of the plays would be known primarily as the pro Stratfordians. So again, I want to get away from the whole anti pro Stratford aspect. So I'll just go out and say, go out on a limb, if you could call it that, and call myself a revisionist. And so the Shakespeare myth. What do we mean by the Shakespeare myth? Right? As we had mentioned before, uh, in digging deeper, why do I continue to persist and call it a myth? It isn't just that Shakespeare is attributed to these plays and poems that we know very well. Plays like Hamlet, Macbeth, Much Ado About Nothing, The Tempest, you know, Richard III, just to name a few, and of course the sonnets as well, right? A number of sonnets. But I would also argue that it's about what has crept around Shakespeare. And this is part of the reason why that Shakespeare is fundamentally a myth, is because right off the bat, we know very little about the man. In fact, we know little to nothing about him. I can't say we know nothing about the man. We know he was born in Stratford upon Avon, and the information that we do have was that he eventually went into London to become uh, involved in the theater, supposedly as an actor. He also eventually went back to Stratford and became a businessman. But what is of importance is trying to correlate what we know of the man compared to what we know of his, not his work, but what his credited work. And I want to stress that credited work, because Shakespeare is credited with writing the plays and sonnets that bear his name, right? He's credited with that, right? But we don't know whether William Shakespeare actually wrote these plays and sonnets. We don't really know. We don't really have the degree of materials in terms of manuscripts, in terms of other supplementary materials, diaries, um, papers, letters, so forth, that would link William Shakespeare to the works themselves, to the plays, to the sonnets, right? So I'd like to start out here by looking at and reading a bit from a piece that I wrote myself for a blog I no longer write. I wrote a blog on medium.com for about 4 years, and I no longer write the blog. I ended it this year. One of my blog pieces was written in December of 2019, December 31st, 2019 to be exact. And the name of the piece is called The Stigma of Print. Was William Shakespeare a writer? I want to specifically read from my conclusion. I could read through the entire piece, but I think that would end up boring people, people who are not used to text, and people who find people reading articles basically sleep inducing. So um, let me just read from my conclusion. The conclusion is, quote, a tale told by an idiot. Um, we cannot rationally account. Oh, by the way, before I read this, in terms of the research for this, for my piece, uh, I looked at, this was one of the, this was the main source. It's probably backwards here, but it's a book called The Truth Will Out, written by Brenda James and William D. Rubenstein. Um, Now, just as James herself, Brenda James is a lecturer, or was a lecturer at the British European Center, and William Rubenstein is professor of modern history at the University College of Wales. So again, this was my primary resource material. It's a book called The Truth Will Out, written, of course, by Brenda James and William D. Rubenstein. Just my primary source material for my blog piece. And the name of the blog piece is The Stigma of Print, just so that you understand that. It can be found at my now old blog, which is closed, but my blog, which is at medium.com / at the doctor 50.com. Right. So let me read from the conclusion of my um, of my blog piece, the stigma of print. We cannot rationally account. This phrase by James and Rubinstein is a perfect description of the notion that William Shakespeare is the author of plays listed in the famous first folio of his work. Notice that I noted the first folio. Uh, my own argument can be described as it doesn't compute or it doesn't parse. It doesn't compute that a man who owned no books at the end of his life, nor owned or read any that we are aware of, you let me go back and read that again. It doesn't compute that a man who owned no books at the end of his life, nor owned or read any of the volumes he used for sources upon which the works of Shakespeare are based, was a writer. It doesn't parse that a man from whom there is no record of a rather basic grammar school education or any formal education, and who ostensibly had a prodigious vocabulary and a body of knowledge in court life and the law, was a writer. In this case, these two invalid premises must lead to an ultimate conclusion. William Shakespeare was not a writer, and therefore could not have written the plays, poems, and sonnets attributed to him. I noted Christopher Columbus at the beginning of this piece. At the beginning of my piece, I used a comparison to Christopher Columbus. As we all know, the noted explorer who was claimed to have discovered America. I noted Christopher Columbus at the beginning of this piece. I should note that Columbus, though accepted officially as the discoverer of America, much like Shakespeare is accepted as the author of the plays, has also been doubted in recent years as the explorer who found the North American continent. If nothing seems too good to be true, it probably isn't. Now, that's just the conclusion to my blog piece there, called The Stigma of Print. So let me go back and read a bit more, just so that you get an idea of some of the basic argumentation that I used in there. Right? Let me look at section 2 of my piece, which is called To Be Educated or To Be Uneducated. That is the question. The issue of literacy brings us to the second plank in the examination and investigation as to whether William Shakespeare was a writer, namely education. Again, if we look at Elizabethan England, we see a nation where most commoners and ordinary citizens were largely illiterate and not educated. Many were not students at any age, and a precious few not only received primary education but advanced education. One such individual was the playwright Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe was raised in Canterbury in Kent and went on to attend the King's School as a young boy. His impressive intelligence and aptitude for learning earned him a scholarship to Corpus Christi College at the University of Cambridge. At Cambridge, Marlowe obtained his bachelor's and master's degree. This was stratospherically impressive for the son of a shoemaker and far different from the norm of men from Marlowe's background. William Shakespeare was raised in the English country town of Stratford and, like Marlowe, from a commoner background. Shakespeare's father was a glover. However, unlike Marlowe, we do not know if Shakespeare attended Stratford's grammar school. No records exist that put him as a student in school. Also, unlike Marlowe, Shakespeare did not attend either of England's great ancient universities, Oxford or Cambridge. And considering the amount of legal knowledge in Shakespeare's play, there is also no record of him being a student at the Inns of Court, the training centers for lawyers that still help train and inform lawyers to this day. So a man who may not have even gone to grammar school, the rudimentary form of education for the few who received any formal form of learning, Elizabethan England, and certainly didn't go on to university, wrote plays and poems. Again, another invalid premise. We should keep in mind, as James and Rubinstein stated in their work, quote, among all of Stratford's 1,300 or so inhabitants, it is likely that only the vicar and the schoolmaster could remotely be described as educated men, and almost certainly a majority of its inhabitants were illiterate. The importance of education when it comes to the works attributed to Shakespeare lies in the depth and breadth of learning in many of the plays. James and Rubinstein state that, quote, Shakespeare had the largest vocabulary of any writer who ever lived. An interesting claim here. The two authors write further that, quote, his works employ nearly 18,000 different and separate words, about twice as many as John Milton used, although Milton was one of the most accomplished graduates of his time at Cambridge University, and perhaps 5 times as many as the average educated person today. An immense vocabulary and prodigious use of diction acquired from what then? Becoming an autodidact, perhaps, and reading on his own. He could have maybe purchased or obtained books from individuals, perhaps. Although I just outlined above, Shakespeare owned no books at the time of his death. So it makes this line of argument highly unlikely. We also have no idea whether Shakespeare could even read. After all, his parents were unable to read and thus wouldn't have been able to teach him. And we have no idea whether he received any formal schooling whatsoever. Maybe he could have acquired impressive vocabulary through a good ear at picking up the speech of various individuals he came into contact with. Perhaps. However, would this have been enough to become an 18,000 word working vocabulary? As a writer that even outstripped the usage of university graduates of the day and beyond? That seems neither likely nor logical to deduce. Finally, let us consider two aspects of information and knowledge in Shakespeare's plays: the ways and means of court life and the law. A number of the plays deal with either life at the royal court of some sort. James and Rubinstein make this point in their book. Quote, Shakespeare of Stratford was an actor whose father was an illiterate butcher, glove maker, and wool merchant in a small provincial town. Yet the author of the plays and poems was obviously familiar with court life and Elizabethan high politics, and apparently addressed senior members of the aristocracy on intimate and equal terms. My own argument is, why would an actor, even if we are being generous and posit that he may have performed at court a couple of times as a performer, care about the ins and outs of court life in an intimate, familiar way? If one accepts the maxim that writers write what they know, how would such a man, a commoner not versed in the comings and goings of court, write about what he didn't know, if not firsthand, then even through hearsay? It should be noted that this era, like many others in the past, did not feature a news industry nor publicly accessible information to the varied aspects of government and politics like we do have today, or like we do now. A person who wasn't titled was not versed in the day-to-day life of English royals and aristocrats, unlike the UK today, where there are actually royal watchers who discuss the royal family, and publications report on the current royal family endlessly. A tabula rasa reading of Shakespeare is that he could not have written about the court life of Elizabethan England because he wasn't part of it. Let me repeat that. A tabula rasa reading of Shakespeare is that he could not have written about the court life of Elizabethan England because he wasn't part of it. Then there is the fact that legal terms and aspects of the law pop up in the plays of Shakespeare. I quote James and Rubinstein yet again. Quote, whoever wrote Shakespeare's work or works must have had a good working knowledge of the law, particularly the law of property and local administration of the legal system. End quote. Again, as noted previously, Shakespeare wasn't trained in the Inns of Court, since his name cannot be found in such records. Some have argued he might have worked as a clerk for a solicitor in order to write about the information found in the plays. This strikes one as an exercise in induction rather than what we can deductively conclude from the facts and documents. One last point is that according to James and Rubinstein, Shakespeare's plays reveal, quote again, Shakespeare's plays reveal a degree of expertise in a wide variety of other topics ranging from falconry to gardening to heraldry, for which we cannot rationally account, given what we know of the life of the Stratford man, end quote. Of course, that was from my blog piece called The Stigma of Print. was William Shakespeare a writer, which can be found at my blog, which I no longer write. I ended the blog last month, but at my blog at www.medium.com/at the Doctor 50. So I just outlined a couple aspects from my blog piece, The Stigma of Print. And the point that I make here is primarily I look at whether Shakespeare was likely a writer or could have been a writer. In that sense, it's sort of like that of the book Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, which also looked at the possibility, whether Shakespeare could have been a writer or not. But my area of examination when it comes to William Shakespeare has to do with whether Shakespeare could have A, been a writer, and B, could have written the plays and sonnets which are attributed to his name, right? Let me just cite one more section from my piece. I know it sounds terrible. It's terribly egotistical, but hey, it's my piece, so whatever. So I'm going back. It's funny. I'm going backwards. I start from the conclusion, and I went in part two, and now I'm at part one, which is a book, my kingdom for a book. All right. As I mentioned before, my source material was, The Truth Will Out, primary source material, right? Which is written by Brenda James and William Rubenstein. Brenda James is a lecturer in English history, and William Rubenstein is a history professor. Yeah. The 2005 book, The Truth Will Out, Unmasking the Real Shakespeare, written by English literature lecturer Brenda James and history professor William Rubenstein, notes, quote, there is no evidence that he ever owned a book. He, of course, meaning William Shakespeare. So a man credited with not only making his living for years as a writer, but also of writing great works, was not the owner of books, let alone a single book. This, by its very nature, strikes one, to use the term known in symbolic logic, as an invalid premise. Historically, what we know as public libraries didn't exist in Elizabethan times in England. The definition of a library of the period was that it was private. A person was either an aristocrat, wealthy, or perhaps upper middle class, had a library in their residence. To be a literate person, let alone a writer of literature as we know it, would have required the ownership of at least a few books or volumes. A man credited as a writer, shown not to have owned any books, makes about as much sense as hiring a person to drive a race car in the Indianapolis 500 who has never driven a car before and knows nothing about automobiles. It is all the more farcical to believe that a man with no known library could be a writer when you consider that writers of the works attributed to Shakespeare must have relied on other sources. Translation, books. James and Rubenstein state in their book that Shakespeare's works, quote, apparently cite or rephrase more than 200 classical and later writers. Let me repeat that. James and Rubenstein state in their book that Shakespeare's works, quote, apparently cite or rephrase more than 200 classical and later writers. Very important point to keep in mind. And that the quote, the list of works apparently used by Shakespeare includes many books which had not been translated into English. The authors of the book, The Truth Will Out, also go on to state that, quote, although Shakespeare was famously credited by Ben Jonson being, as an aside, he was a playwright, well-known playwright of the era, quote, although Shakespeare was famously credited by Ben Jonson with having small Latin and less Greek, the bard was also familiar with many of the great writers of ancient Greece, end quote. Quote, even Orthodox Stratfordians admit that the author read relatively recent works in French, Italian, and Spanish, which had not been translated into English. Among them, Belforce's Histories Tragiques, Ser Giovanni's Il Bercone, Jorge de Montemayor's Diana in Cinthio's Epithea and Hiratomiti. Quote, note James and Rubinstein. Since we have no record of Shakespeare owning Belforest, de Montemayor, or Cinthio's volumes, let alone any volume whatsoever, it is unlikely that this man Shakespeare, a man born and raised in rural Stratford, who from what we know went on to London to become an actor before eventually returning to his hometown to settle down with family and become a merchant and businessman, could have been a writer of plays, let alone plays attributed to him. After all, as James and Rubinstein argue, quote, where did he, a young, struggling, itinerant actor, acquire this knowledge? Let me quote this again, and this is, of course, James and Rubinstein from the book The Truth Will Out, 2005 book. The Truth Will Out, Unmasking the Real Shakespeare. Right? After all, as James and Rubinstein argue, quote, where did he, a young, struggling, itinerant actor, acquire this knowledge? Keep that in mind. My conclusion is he didn't gain this knowledge because he could not have. Having a library or books clearly owned and in his possession would clearly have indicated that William Shakespeare was a literate man and thus possibly a writer. The absence of books indicates that Shakespeare, who came from a family of illiterate parents and whose daughters ended up being illiterate, confirms no indication of literacy. So I've read more of my blog piece entitled The Stigma of Print, Was William Shakespeare a Writer, which I had written back in December of 2019, than I intended. But it gives you an idea of my formal stated written position in regards to whether William Shakespeare, or should I say, my formal written position as someone who is a revisionist, thus not someone who credits William Shakespeare with the writing of the plays and sonnets that are normally attributed to him. Right. So I read more than I intended. So apologize for that. I'm sorry if that was boring. I know people don't like to. There are people who don't like to read, and people don't want to hear things read, and so I apologize for that. But I had to state it so as to make the case. So that gives you an idea of my overall take on what is formerly known as the Shakespeare authorship question. Right? Those of us who, kind of doing a William Hurt here from Broadcast News. Or is it Albert Brooks? Oh, Albert Brooks, I think. Yeah. As I was saying, almost forgot. That gives you an idea. When I had just quoted, and not only the source material I had, just to state it again, my source material for my blog piece, or essay if you want, The Stigma Print, was this. The Truth Will Out, written by Brenda James and William Rubinstein. Brenda James, of course, is an English lecturer. Rubinstein is a professor. Specifically, Brenda James, I don't know if she still is, because this book came out more than a decade ago, far more than a decade ago. But Brenda James was at the time at the British European Center as an English literature lecturer. And William D. Rubinstein is a professor of modern history at the University College of Wales at Aberystwyth. And so this was the book that I used for primary source material for my blog piece, for my essay, The Truth Will Out. Okay. So there I've outlined my basic position in regards to the Shakespeare authorship question, right? So my take on it is questioning, was William Shakespeare a writer? So I look at it from a very specific or fairly specific aspect. Was William Shakespeare a writer? And if so, and if he wasn't, he could not have. See, if you prove that William Shakespeare wasn't a writer, therefore he could not have written the plays and the poems, or should I say sonnets attributed to him, right? Now, some people may be wondering, well, why am I a revisionist? Why am I somebody who has taken up the Shakespeare authorship question privately? This is the first time, really publicly, that I've discussed this. Um, and people who may not be aware of my background, I was a freelance journalist for 22 years and a freelance writer for 22 years. From about 1994 until 2017, with about 4 months, I had initially quit the business in 2000. Let me see, 2004. Yeah, about 2004, and I quit the business in 2004. Not intending to go back to freelancing, but things didn't quite work out, and went back to freelancing in 2005. So, just a little bit of my history there. Just largely 1994 to I guess 2017 when I retired, February. And I wrote my blog for Medium.com from about April 2017 till about February of 2022, February of this year, which is where my blog piece, The Stigma of Print, was William Shakespeare, a writer, could be found and can, I guess, still be found online. Now, at this point, now that I've outlined what my position is and what my specific area of, not so much expertise, but my area of examination is in regards to Shakespeare, people may be wondering, why did I get involved with the Shakespeare authorship question, at least now to this extent on YouTube, right? The reason why I did basically stems from the fact that I, uh, well, I have a complete works of William Shakespeare, right? I don't know if I should show them on camera here, but I have a complete works of William Shakespeare, and yeah, the I was reading through one of the plays. Oh, what the hell? I'll be back. Let me get my complete works. Hold on. All righty, and we're back. Sorry about that. Commercial break. So this is my complete works of William Shakespeare. I've had this for, I don't know, maybe 20 years. I think. I think I've had it for at least 20 years. I don't know if you can see that right off the bat. Complete works of Shakespeare. Okay. This is my complete works. Right. And so when I was reading my complete works, I was at one point excuse me. I was reading Henry V. I remember one day I was reading Henry V. Okay. Henry V. This is what I was reading. And I was going through Henry V. And I was reading this. And I took French when I was in college. I wasn't very good at it. And so I was trying to read the French, what little I recall of the French. And I'm looking at, I believe this is Act 3, 4 of Henry V. And, I was just reading through this. And I will not, I'll try, I'm tempted to try to speak French, but I will not. Um, so I was reading the French in Henry V, and I'm reading through the French, and I'm reading through the French because there are portions. Like I said, I cited the. I don't know if this was the exact scene, but it's a scene like it. So I cited for those of you just joining us, Act 3, Scene 4 of Henry V. And I'm reading this and I'm going, how in the hell did someone like William Shakespeare, who's from a provincial English town, how did this guy pick up French? Even if he picked up French, how is this guy writing a play like this? It was the French that really got me. It was the language. It was the French that really started making doubts in my mind. Because I'm reading this and I'm going, I'm reading these words and I'm reading this French. And again, I took French in college. I wasn't great at it, but I'm reading. I'm trying to get through the French as much as I can. And I'm going, how is it that someone like Shakespeare wrote something like this? That's what caused the doubt in my mind. I can't explain where it came from. I can't explain why, but that's what first got led me to the to doubt. That's where doubt entered. That's where doubt creeped up. I was reading Henry V, right? And that led me, I think, to start reading some books that examine the authorship. Unfortunately, I can't recall the books. I can't recall too many books. There was, of course, The Truth Will Out. Of course, that was one of the books that I used, the book that I used as source material for my essay. But also, I also read other books about Shakespeare, right? And I came across not I just and I later found out that there were not only famous individuals like Charlie Chaplin and Orson Welles and others who supposedly doubted that William Shakespeare wrote the plays, right? Um, but also individuals who had written books about it, right? Mark Twain had written a book called, I believe, Was Shakespeare Dead? Or, sorry, not Was Shakespeare Dead, Is Shakespeare Dead? Sorry, my apologies. And I think Mark Twain was a doubter of it. So there are relatively famous people. And of course, you have Shakespearean actors like Derek Jacobi and Mark Rylance, who doubt that William Shakespeare, wrote the plays and sonnets. Um, and so it isn't so called, now some people may argue, is that peer pressure, right? Is it famous peer pressure of a sort, right? Is it like you're being influenced? No, I wasn't influenced. What I did was read Henry V, and I read the French, and I read the French phrases, and I read the language, having taken French myself, though I was not great at it, even though I have a French last name, but I won't get into that because it's not relevant. But I read the passages within Henry V where they were speaking in French, and that is what began my journey into the Shakespeare authorship question. It was reading the works themselves. It wasn't what some commentator said. It wasn't what some critic said or literary critic. It wasn't what another writer said. It was what I read. It was what I saw. It was what I thought about. When it comes to whether Shakespeare was the author of the plays and sonnets, one should and must have reasonable doubt, just as in the law. Because when it comes to William Shakespeare, the reality is we really don't know much about this man. We don't. We don't know whether he went to grammar school in Stratford, because the records are not extant. They don't survive. We don't know whether this man actually was able to write. So if we don't know he had an education, and we know according to his will that he didn't have books that he left to people, apparently, because if we look at the itemization of his property and his personal property, books are not listed. So my point, as I mentioned in my work, basically in my piece, The Stigma of Print, my point is, well, if you don't have books, how can you be a writer? It's very clear I'm a writer, because what do I have here? Books. This is another book of mine. This is a history of the English language. And it's written by Albert C. Bow, a man with an outstanding name. Albert, much like mine. Now, this is another old book that I have, very old book. Now, I haven't read this book in quite a long time, right? So, it's interesting to me. So it's interesting. Why don't I look up what this book says about Shakespeare? This book came out. I haven't read this book in quite a while. This book came out in 1963. Oh, sorry, the copyright was renewed in 63. This book came out. The book, of course, is A History of the English Language. Copyright's 1957 by the Appleton Century Company, Incorporated. Now, let me just see what they have to write about Shakespeare here, just as an interesting, because I haven't seen this in a while. Good. Okay. Right. Well, this deals with language, so let me just read what it says here. English grammar in the 16th and early 17th centuries marked more by the survival of certain forms and usages that have since disappeared than by any fundamental developments. The great changes which reduced the inflections of Old English to their modern proportions had already taken place. In the few parts of speech which retain some of their original inflections, the reader of Shakespeare, or the authorized version, is conscious of minor differences of form, and in the framing of sentences he may note differences of syntax and idiom which, while they attract attention, are not sufficient to interfere sufficiently with or seriously with understanding. The more important of these differences we may pass briefly in review. Right? It's interesting on, that was on page 290. On page 292, it notes, a double comparative or superlative is also fairly frequent. Shakespearean comparisons like honester, violentist are now replaced by the analytical forms. A double comparative or superlative is also fairly frequent in the work of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. The more larger, most boldest, or Mark Antony's, this was the most unkindest cut of all. Let me look up. Too bad I don't have Jeopardy theme music running for this part. My apologies on the quiet here. Hmm. Hmm. Sorry, I'm getting lost in this book. Well, anyway, I just had cited a little bit there of Shakespeare. Um, so my apologies. Um, I know most people get used to YouTube being full of, to quote Shakespeare, be full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, right? But I've kind of given you a little flavor there, a little taste of, um, you know, I looked at in my piece, which is the stigma of print. I laid out what my basic position is, and that is that I contest whether William Shakespeare was a writer, let alone the writer of the plays and sonnets. And I contest it because years ago, when looking at the plays, it created considerable doubt. What we know of the man doesn't conform to what the plays themselves and the sonnets state. Um, so this is what's fascinating about. This is what's interesting to me about the Shakespeare authorship question. Of course, the Shakespeare authorship question is basically anathema when it comes to the academic world, right? I mean, I myself have a bachelor's degree, um, as you can probably tell from my wall. Um, I have a bachelor's degree. I studied English. I studied literature. In fact, I will point out that in case people are wondering, well, why am I, a former freelance journalist and a freelance writer, discussing literature, especially such grand and important literature as Shakespeare? Well, it's because I studied literature myself. So I want to point out that in order to graduate from college, I had to write a senior project. And I just, some time back, I had looked in some storage and found the remnants of my old college senior project, just here. And my senior project, let me see here, was about James Boswell, and it basically was an examination of the life of Boswell, which is written by James Boswell. Um, James Boswell was writing about Samuel Johnson, who had created the two-volume English dictionary, or as they would say in England, English dictionary, which is considered one of the great works of English literature. And so James Boswell, who was a friend of Samuel Johnson's, wrote his biography. He wrote a biography of Samuel Johnson, known as The Life of Johnson. So I wrote my senior project in order to graduate from college on the life of Johnson. So, yeah, the writing of the life of Johnson. It was called The Peculiar Plan. It was named after another biography. Um, but this is my senior project. So I studied English. And as you can tell, dot matrix printer papers. Not these. Dot matrix printer. Sorry. Dot matrix printer papers. 1990s. So just wanted to point that out. Um, sorry. As I'm saying, I'm new to YouTube, so forgive the imperfections. Consider this a pilot, which it is. It's a pilot. So, I believe there you have it. That is well. Well, before I finish in this vein, uh, let me just point out a couple of other aspects. Um, Again, this is my old books. Sorry. Again, just to cite this, this is my Shakespeare complete works. This is where I okay. So and this is known as the Draushout. This is from the first folio, the Draushout picture, right? Now, it's a rather odd picture when you look at it. And people have pointed this out in documentaries questioning Shakespeare as the author, right? Because they question this head, the placement of this head here and over here. The way the head is placed in the body. Very interesting, kind of odd. Something to leave you with in regards to it. But to kind of sum up, when we talk about, and when I talk about the Shakespeare myth, my primary aspect in regards to this myth, which of course attributes William Shakespeare as the writer of the plays and sonnets, plays such as, of course, Richard III and Henry V, and Taming of the Shrew, Merchant of Venice, etc., to this William Shakespeare. And the problem with William Shakespeare is we know very little about the man. We have very little records of him that tie him in regards to extant materials as a writer. For example, this was my senior project. So clearly you can see that it's a remnant of something I wrote. It's a record that I, in this case, typed, but that I wrote it, right? But we don't have something like this in regards to Shakespeare. Let's call that one. Lack of written materials, documents, and diaries, and other materials that link William Shakespeare to the works or demonstrate that William Shakespeare wrote the works. Problem number one. We also have the fact that when it comes to William Shakespeare as an individual, that he is someone who apparently did not receive a university education or any kind of formal education in terms of higher formal education. And there's no record that he received any, let's just say, lower formal education at a grammar school, because Stratford did have one. So we don't know whether he attended the Stratford Grammar School or the grammar school in Stratford at the time, because his father was an official, a town official. So he was eligible to go to school as the son of that official. But we don't know whether he did or not. So we don't even know the extent of his education. And we do know that in order to be a writer, you had to have some form of literacy, not just basic literacy, but you had to have a knowledge of extensive, you had to have extensive word knowledge and a pretty extensive vocabulary. So that's problem number two, lack of records of any education or lack of apparent education. Then we have the third problem, which is that in his will, or in the will of William Shakespeare, there's no mention made of books. Books that he owned, books that he borrowed, books that he had, no indication of books whatsoever. And this asks the rather apparent and obvious question, which is how can one be a writer if one isn't reading? To be a writer, you need to be able to read. As I've demonstrated in my life as a writer, my books, complete works of Shakespeare, history of the English language, and of course, the source material for my essay, The Truth Will Out. Books, which is what a writer needs, not only to keep up in whatever field he is writing in, but also to sustain himself as a what I would call a lexical professional. To our knowledge, Shakespeare did not possess or own any books. Problem number three. So the first problem, of course, is that Shakespeare was someone who we have absolutely no records of in regards to. So we don't know whether he had an education. We don't know whether he owned any books, and we really don't even have any records tying him to the works. No written materials, no diaries, no other source material that he might have used. Nothing. We know some of the source material that he must have read in order to create these plays, as I cited in my blog piece, my essay, "The Stigma of Print." So those three problems: lack of materials tying to him, lack of written materials, lack of education, lack of books. When we look at all three of these problem areas, we can only conclude that William Shakespeare was not and could not have been a writer. He was a businessman, because we have records to indicate that. And who knows, he might have been a genius of a businessman. Who knows? We don't know. But we know he was a businessman. But we only know he was a writer because of the first folio. And the first folio tells us that he was a writer. He's credited with it. And the first folio itself is very suspicious as far as I'm concerned. It's very odd. Well, at this time, I know there have been some people in the chat. If they're still around, I don't know if they're still around. But if anybody has any questions or disputations or any responses defending William Shakespeare, now's the time. Pipe up. Say your piece. I guess not. Oh, boy. Yes. Sorry for all the silences, you know. Well, you need more than a minute. I had just seen it here. It said you'll need a minute. Well, you better hurry because I'm getting ready to shut this inaugural live down. So, those of you who are in the chat, those of you who are out there watching this in the clouds or so forth, if you are so called, let's just say traditionalists, not pro Stratfordians, traditionalists, let's hear what you have to say. Let's hear you. If you're not in the comment section, have some comments and I'll here and now. No, that is to the person in the chat. No, it's not from my Twitter. Just so you know. Mm. Well, I. What's my next topic? I'm asking you. I'm asking you will do the. I guess you traditionalists are wimps out there. You traditionalists are wimps. Are there any traditionalists out there in the clouds? Those of you who are pro Shakespeare, where are you? Where is your evidence? Quote unquote. I've outlined my thesis. I've outlined what I wrote in my piece, and I've made my arguments. Where's yours? No comment from the peanut gallery? Is that it? Really? Nothing to say, folks? Wow, I'm so disappointed. No, I'm not. uh, I mean, seriously, are there any questions? Disagreements? Disputations? Contentions? What? I didn't really expect this. When I chose this to do as my first live, I don't even know if it was going to work as a live. But, it's. I think this. I think it's. I think this is scaring. I shouldn't be talking in this fashion because it's not formal. But what the heck, you know, uh, YouTube is informal anyway. I think YouTube is oh, am I going to be? Oh, okay. I think YouTube is clearly not the place for a literate discussion. And but what the hell? I'm going to do it anyway, and I just did. Well, you can talk. You can discuss it now. I'm saying, do the people in the chat have any questions? You've heard what I have to say. You have nothing to offer, nothing to contest, nothing to try to debate. Oh, you want to be ready. That's not how it works. Oh, I can get ready. No, you want to cheat. No cheating. No cheating allowed. So, seriously, after all that, nobody has anything to dispute and no one has anything to say? Really? this is hilarious to me. This is hilarious. Um, well, I'm kind of glad. I'm kind of glad. Anyway, I think that's it. This was the first and I think last live that I will be doing in regards to YouTube. Um, I know again. I'm a writer, and the ideal of this live show is to look at literature, film, and TV and issues therein. Um, and so I looked at literature first. So as you can tell, or anyone who searches can tell, there are plenty of discussions in regards to Shakespeare. So, uh, wait, what do you mean? Don't stop? I don't even think anyone's. I don't even think anyone's watching this, which is great because I could, which makes it even better that no one is watching it. You know, those of us who are into a literature and dissecting and vivisecting it, um, we don't really need a huge audience. It's good if you can, I guess, but I don't really care. Um, I really enjoyed doing this live because I think I had always wanted to come out and discuss the Shakespeare authorship question and my particular position therein in regards to it, and I have done that, and I've enjoyed it. Yeah, I don't. Uh, Someone's in the chat saying, "Don't stop the live." Nah, I don't think so. Nah, no, I enjoy doing the live. Just to say, I enjoy doing the live, but it is literature, and it's not exciting. I mean, it doesn't move the YouTube algorithm, and I don't really care about that. All I care about is doing what I want to do. So I know that people who are hardcore, serious Shakespeare lovers will probably watch this, which I'm perfectly fine with. In fact, I need them to watch it. Um, and maybe they'll dispute this in the comments. If so, but in any event, I think that's it for me. And so this has been the live show. I'm Albert Lanier, and I've been live. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the people in the chat. Um, Thank you for those who watch from the clouds and those elsewhere. I enjoyed discussing this topic. I enjoyed doing this, and this was actually kind of fun. It was kind of fun. It's kind of odd to talk to a camera. It's still kind of odd to me. It's not what I do, but um, it's sort of odd. But again, I'd like to thank the people in the chat, those who might make comments or end up doing comments, those watching from the clouds or bushes or whatever it is they call it. Thank you for everyone for watching this live. That's been the live show. Good day.